Greetings from Washington, D.C. This is Khalil Jahshan, Executive Director of Arab Center, Washington, D.C. And I would like to welcome you to another episode, if you will, of our expert interviews. My special guest today is a good friend, Ori Nir. Ori is Vice President for Public Affairs at Americans for Peace Now. He joined APN following a rich, long 24-year career in journalism, which was mainly focused on the Arab-Israeli conflict, which of course makes him an expert in our view with regards to this. Ori, of course, covered the Palestinian affairs for Haaretz daily, Israel's leading newspaper back in the mid-80s to 1990, and again in 94 to 96. And he, of course, during that period covered the First Intifada, covered the earlier phases of the Oslo process. Later, he covered Israel's Arab minority for Haaretz in 2000, 2002, and essentially covered extensively the diplomatic efforts to advance Arab-Israeli peace throughout the different attempts that happened during that period. As the Washington correspondent of Haaretz back in the early 90s, he also reported to The Forward, America's largest and most influential independent national Jewish weekly newspaper. He focused also on U.S. Mideast policy. Ori earned a master's degree in journalism from the University of California, Berkeley, where he also taught journalism. His BA degree is in Middle East history and Arabic literature from the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. And I might add that Ori is also fluent in Hebrew and in Arabic. Ahlan wa sahlan, Ori.
Ahlan Fiq Khalil, and I'm assuming that some of our, or maybe many of our viewers today are Muslim. It's Friday over the Adha, so I wanted to wish everyone a happy holiday. Kol aam wa antum bkhair.
Thank you very much. A lot of things are happening, and practically speaking, what prompted this interview is your recent article in the New York Times, an opinion piece entitled "A Dangerous Shift is Underway in the West Bank," that appeared only a few days ago. What prompted you, Ori, to write this article? Particularly, what do you mean by shift is underway in the occupied territories, and what makes it dangerous?
So what prompted me was the observation that with this government, a government that includes some of the most radical activists, not even politicians, but activists in Israeli society, among the Israeli settler movement, with this government, the settlers, the violent settlers, the extremist settlers, really feel that they have wind in their sails, and therefore are trying to implement the vision, which until now was just dreams, of actually kicking out, pushing out the Palestinians in the West Bank. It sounds like a conspiracy theory, and I've received some reactions to the article which accused me of that, but it really is not. It is not. And the reason why it's not is, A, that we know that this goal has been and still is the dream of many of the radical settlers. When I say radical settlers, what I mean by that is the ideological settlers, those who are the messianic ones, if you will, who believe that by settling the West Bank, they are fulfilling some kind of a religious edict. That we know, and we also know that at least three that I can think of the ministers in this government who deal directly with West Bank issues, particularly one of them who is Minister Smotrich, Bezalel Smotrich, who handles civilian affairs in the West Bank, has a plan. He has authored a plan that, among other things, talks about expelling Palestinians from the West Bank, those who would not agree to the conditions that he's posing for them to become citizens in a future Israel that annexes the West Bank. Those who somehow resist will be expelled according to his plan. So this is not some kind of a conspiracy theory, but it really relies on facts on the ground. So again, just to recap, we've seen a settler movement that has expressed in the past the wishes, the dreams, if you will, of expulsion, tarhil, if you will, of settlers from the West Bank. We see settlers in the government who have plans for that. And we see actions on the ground by settlers, which are much, much more violent and more widespread, violent actions, which cannot be, I think, interpreted only as reprisal, only as revenge, but I think are harnessed to a larger plan of making life so unbearable for Palestinians in the West Bank that they will just have to leave.
Thank you, Ori. As you know, there are quite a few articles that have been written, particularly in the Israeli progressive, I would say, or even mainstream media with regards to what's happening in the occupied West Bank. But the word you just mentioned, tarhil, expulsion, a lot of people in the West, particularly here in the States, they think this is like Palestinian paranoia. You know, when Palestinians refer to the potential or possibility of another Nakba, they feel like they are making it up. Yet you kind of put it like, you know, in a central position in your op-ed piece. And when I hear, for example, in the last hours, UN envoy Thor Wennesland on Tuesday actually mentioned to the UN Security Council that there is this alarming spike in violence in the West Bank. And I'm quoting him, and he is saying, unless decisive steps are taken now to rein that violence, there is a significant risk that events could deteriorate further. Could you comment on that?
Yes, you know, just like, you know, Israeli Jews and Jews, you know, around the world have past experiences, horrible experiences that are haunting them today. So do Palestinians have a horrible experience of the Nakba of 1948 that is haunting them, and the Nakba of 1967 as well. And many people tend to say that this is some kind of an end of times scenario that is not rational. However, and again, I mentioned Bezalel Smotrich earlier, in an interview that he gave to Haaretz in 2016, he actually talks about the Nakba. He talks about the 1948 experience as a model for what he would like to happen. The interviewer asks him, do you think it's really realistic to expect that Palestinians will move en masse or be kicked out en masse? And he says, of course, look at what happened in 1948. So the fear, the fear that this will reoccur is anchored in actual how would I put it, aspirational statements that were made by a person who today, you know, in this government is responsible for civilian affairs in the West Bank. There is reason for alarm.
In a way, the fox is in charge of the hen house these days. I mean, you and I have been used to the fact that there have been some radicalism within the settlers movement over the years. You've reported about that extensively over the years. But instead of being just a lobby, as we used to refer to them within the Israeli political system, now they are the government. They are part and parcel of the coalition.
Yeah, and I have
is that making a difference for them?
Oh yeah, for sure. You know, in the past, I am the one who used to say to Palestinian friends and interviewees and so on, you're obsessed with 1948, with the Nakba. It won't happen again. It can't happen again, which I truly believed in. Looking at things today and looking at what the wishes and the scenarios are being put forward by, again, senior members of this government, and it's not only Smotrich. I can think of two other government members from his party. it is not just how would I put it, an irrational fear. It really is anchored so yes, he I mean, there are people in the government who are giving not only, I'll put it differently. There are people in the government who not only have these dreams and they're trying to fulfill them, but they're also giving backing, backing to people on the ground, settlers on the ground who are taking action, violent action, to fulfill that kind of scenario.
You use the term girush, expulsion. It's a Hebrew expression, and then you put it in its current, if you will, status as girush akshav, expulsion right now. And is that what you mean by saying that this is not fiction anymore? It's not just a figment of Palestinian imagination?
Yes, I mean, in the piece, I use it as a, kind of a literary means and so on. But the idea is to express through that, to express the notion and the sentiment among settlers that they have government backing to fulfill those end of times dreams. And we're dealing with people who are messianic, whose dreams and aspirations are messianic and are end of time, are of the nature of end of times. So that was the idea. Yeah.
I noticed this morning one of your former colleagues at Haaretz published today an analysis piece calling it Crazy Times, as Israeli settlers rampage with impunity, army brass described an unprecedented reality.
Yeah.
Is it really unprecedented what we see? I mean, we've seen a lot of ugliness, okay, over the past 56 years. But what prompts the Central Command in Israel this morning to tell Amos Harel that what they are talking about is really crazy times? In other words, totally abnormal times.
Yeah. So, okay, we have seen settler violence for decades now.
Yes.
I remember seeing it in the mid 80s when I started covering the West Bank, and it's been with us all the time. What I think is new here is a few things. First, the depth and the breadth. While we've seen settler violence and pretty serious one in the past, waves of it, we haven't seen systematic attempts, successful, unfortunately, attempts to burn houses and burn cars, with people inside, knowing that there are people inside. Palestinian villagers in Turmus Aya were in their houses when they were torched, and the settlers knew it. So that's one thing, the severity of the actions, and the other is the breadth. We have not seen in the past 400 settlers, by the way, religious settlers who did it on a Saturday, okay, violating Shabbat, but that's their business. 400 descending on a small village, well, it's not so small, Turmus Aya of, I think, 10,000 people or something like that, and wreaking havoc. That kind of thing.
Most of whom happen to be American citizens, right? Turmus Aya is heavily populated by Palestinian Americans.
Yeah. By the way, quite a few of the settlers, unfortunately, the one that I described in my story in the New York Times, are also American citizens. But anyway, that's a kind of a side issue. The breadth of it is something that is also unprecedented, and I think that the third component, which is very important, is that the level of backing that they are getting from members of this government, both people from the extremist parties of Smotrich and Ben-Gvir and Orit Struk, and from members of Likud as well, that kind of backing is also unprecedented.
I think in your op-ed piece, you referred to the coverage of the New York Times in the past, which described the current situation in the occupied West Bank as one of the most intense episodes of settler-led violence in memory. Aside from the intensity you mentioned with regards to the number of people involved, hundreds, but I think you also refer to the fact that there has been already 440 settler attacks on Palestinians in the West Bank this year.
Yes.
This is totally abnormal.
It's abnormal. I'll tell you more than that, Khalil. These are incidents that are reported. So I took the information from OCHA, the UN body that follows violations of Palestinian human rights in the West Bank, in Gaza. Many of the attacks by settlers on Palestinians are not reported. Palestinians are afraid to report because of the fear of recrimination. These are only attacks where there was either serious damage to property or to people, where there were casualties. There are many petty attacks that are not reported at all, and there are many that are not that petty, which are not reported. So yes, the numbers are frightening. I have to say there's one more thing that I think also serves maybe less directly as wind in the sails of the violent settlers, and that is the increased verve with which the IDF has been conducting counterterrorism attacks in the West Bank. That is something that one can justify. I'm not going into the, whether it's justified or not, and so on. And one could say, yes, but those are actions taken against terrorists and so on. Fine. The intensity and sometimes the lack of sensitivity, and this is an understatement, to casualties who are non-combatants, I think also by the IDF also serves as wind in the sails of the settlers.
I see. Frankly, I mean, this is not necessarily scientific research. We have to look into that a bit more deeper, I would say. But this, what you just referred to, the fact, like when you look at the activities of the IDF going back to Jenin, the attack on the camp, the intensity of the attack, the carelessness, if you will, even by Israeli standards, by IDF standards, with regards to civilians and so on, was followed by a series of attacks by the settlers on different villages and towns in occupied Palestine. So are you saying that what is happening in the Hawaras of this world, the Tormos Ayas of this world, the Jalud, the Safa, the Ain Samia, all these incidents, one right after the other, are related to kind of tough clashes conducted by the IDF with Palestinian fighters in the West Bank?
Indirectly, I think, in at least two ways that I can think of. One is what is called the cycle of violence. In other words, the revenge that then causes revenge when there is one. As far as I know, I'm almost certain of that. The two gunmen who shot the settlers near Eli, the settlement, were avenging the blood that was spilled in Jenin. That's my understanding. I'm not quite certain about it. So that's one way. The other way, though, and that's something that has worried me for years, is what I am quite convinced is the case of a certain erosion of norms in the IDF when it comes to Palestinian lives. It used to be, I served in the IDF, I remember those norms. It used to be that if you suspected that there could be casualties in civilians in an operation, you would not carry out that operation. If you knew that there were children in a home that was targeted because a Palestinian terrorism suspect was living there, you would not target that home. if you saw a Palestinian who was bleeding after being shot, whether he was suspected of being a terrorist or not, after he was shot and did not pose any danger to the soldiers, you would go and give him first aid. Those things, we do not see them anymore. Palestinians, again and again, and I've seen it, are left to bleed after being shot. There is much less of a care about about casualties in civilians and non-combatants. And I think that atmosphere, that perception that Palestinian lives are worth less, I say it with a heavy heart, but I think that is a notion that is seeping into Israeli society at large, also serves to indirectly to further motivate violent settlers. That's my belief.
Well, as a keen observer of these practices, I would have to say that we were accustomed for decades, and I'm sure you can confirm that, for the argument that was used in let's say, for several decades by the Israeli Hasbara and propaganda, the concept of purity of arms, that the IDF does not do things like this. I don't hear that being used these days, as if it's no longer needed or applicable.
Less so. I think that it's one can say that a kind of a propaganda argument that was used in the past, the people don't feel the need to use it anymore. But I think that, and I'm being very careful with it, I really think that there were stricter norms in the IDF when it came to the use of force, both as a reporter and as a soldier who served in the IDF. I remember norms that were stricter. I remember much more care about the IDF's responsibility to not harm non-combatants. And today, I am quite convinced that these things have eroded.
Since you mentioned service in the IDF, let me ask you a couple of questions. On the one hand, the quote I just used a couple of minutes ago, leaders in the Central Command are basically saying these are crazy times. In other words, abnormal developments. They admit that they somehow have lost control or lack the means and the support from the government to do what they are asked to do. At the same time, we haven't heard that very often in the past few years, but now it's been repeated at the highest levels of the Israeli military that what is happening are pogroms.
Yeah. What's
happening in the IDF? How do we reconcile this schizophrenic kind of reaction?
Okay, so that is not my specialty. I'm not, I wasn't a military correspondent, but I think that I know enough to give at least an interpretation, my own interpretation, and that is that the IDF, although legally, according to international law, the IDF is supposed to protect Palestinian civilians. That is definitely its role there. However, the practice on the ground is that for years, the IDF has seen itself and has conditioned its troops to see their role as protecting the settlers against Palestinian violence. As long as settler violence was tame and not systematic and not as prevalent as we've seen it before, that kind of dissonance of the IDF letting the settlers roam free and do whatever they want and not protecting Palestinians when they're being attacked was sort of tolerated and it was not such a severe dissonance. However, when you have such, as we referred to before, large scale, severe, systematic settler attacks, and the IDF continues kind of the force with its being conditioned to not intervene and protect Palestinians when they're being attacked, becomes a real problem. And it's for the world to see, because there are cameras now everywhere. And these instances of soldiers standing aside and in some cases even assisting and abetting settlers in their violence against Palestinians is something that's being documented and shown around the world. And when that happens, questions are being asked. Thankful, I have to say, thank God that there are some people still in the IDF and in Israeli society at large who ask these questions. But so at least there's some modicum of accountability still, and that is something that, to be thankful for to some extent.
Thank you, Ori. Let's spend just a couple of minutes on the American role or the administration's response to the situation. It was a key part of your op-ed piece. You made some recommendations, actually, or appeal to the U.S. government how to react to this very serious situation. And in your first answer today, you did mention the fact that there is an American component to this craziness, as the Central Command described it. In other words, Americans on both sides of the equation here. And it seems to me that the administration has really been struggling with this issue, and particularly now that there is an American component, if you will, to the escalating fighting that's taking place. What is your recommendation exactly for those who have not read your article? What are you asking the administration to do in response to these events?
So this is something that my organization has dealt with quite a bit recently, and it's something that I have my own opinions about. Maybe I'll just to put it in context and give a little bit of background. I'll say, and it's something that I know that your organization, Khalil, as well, has been documenting very carefully since the Biden administration came to office. The Biden administration came in with the intention to keep out of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict to the extent possible, to not get involved, to not make this definitely to not make it a priority. They have other priorities. It's totally understood around the world. And the idea was, let's not get involved. We're not going to be doing any kind of peacemaking and so on and so forth. The problem is that when the United States turns its involvement and attention from the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and when you have a government that is so radical, the message being sent to this government and to other forces in Israeli society is, we can do whatever we want, whether it's settlement construction or violence or things of that sort. And that's what we've been seeing on the ground. Unfortunately, the US cannot only get involved when things become completely catastrophic on the one side, or when there are some prospects for peace. The US has to be, because of its relationship with Israel, if the US wants to prevent these kinds of scenes that we've seen coming from the West Bank recently, the US has to keep staying involved. And unfortunately, it's not doing so, as far as I'm concerned, as far as my organization is concerned. It's not doing so, how would I put it, diligently enough. We've seen some signs that are encouraging on the margins recently. For example, the Biden administration reversing the Trump administration's decision to apply research projects, to apply U.S. involvement and aid for research projects in settler institutions of the West Bank. But these are small things. The United States, if it really wants to make an impression on this Israeli government, and I'm saying this with really a heavy heart, I'm a dual citizen. I care about Israel. If the U.S. does not use its many, many leverages, and it has many leverages on Israel, including things like conditioning aid, it will not see results, and with this government particularly. So in order to see results, the U.S. really have to start using some more potent leverages. Time has come for that. We don't see results otherwise.
Particularly in light of the fact that you and your organization have reported accurately the massive increase when you're talking about 13,000 units being added to the settlements in spite of begging by this administration not to do so. It seems to be like it's doing that on purpose to spite the administration, despite the heavy price in the bilateral relationship between the main, most important ally of Israel, as of course defined by Israel and by the United States. So the relationship is not as seamless as a result as it used to be. Ori, thank you so much. Really appreciate your time. You clarified a lot of issues for us. And we thank the audience, those who are watching and those who will be watching this program. We hope you find this expert conversation or interview useful in trying to understand the circumstances that we face in the region, particularly in the occupied West Bank. Thank you, Ori, again, and we hope to see you soon.
Thank you, Khalil.